December 28, 1835. The Edhu Swamp, northern Florida territory. The sun had not yet broken the horizon, but the air already tasted of blood and smoke. 15 white men, overseers, slave-catch mercenaries, lay dead in the mud, suggests, their scalps torn from their skulls, their rifles shattered, their dogs silent. The Seminole warriors who killed them had vanished into the sawgrass like shadows swallowed by darker shadows. This was not a battle. This was a message. And the message was carved into the earth with steel, fury, and the broken bones of men who believed themselves untouchable. For years, the Seminole nation had become a sanctuary for the hunted, escaped slaves who fled the whip and chain, suggests Creek refugees, black Seminoles who had intermarried and built lives free from bondage. The swamps of Florida were their fortress, their rebirth. But the United States government, suggests driven by plantation owners who demanded the return of property, had unleashed hunting parties, armed overseers who burned villages, dragged families back in irons, and left trails of terror. On this morning, 15 of those hunters entered Seminole land. They would never leave. What happened in the Wahoo Swamp was not savagery. It was justice delivered by those who had been denied it for too long. It was the reckoning that empires fear most, jests, when the oppressed stop running and turn to face their oppressors with fire in their eyes. This is not a story you were taught in school. It will not be found in the sanitized pages of textbooks that celebrate westward expansion and manifest destiny. But if you stay with me, if you walk into the swamp, into the smoke, suggests into the truth, you will witness one of the most brutal and righteous acts of resistance in American history. You will meet warriors whose names were erased but whose legend lives in the soil, suggests, and you will understand why 15 men who came to hunt human beings never made it home. So subscribe, join this journey into the shadows of history, because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a reckoning that echoes still, suggests. The Wahoo Swamp was not a place, it was a living entity, ancient and unforgiving. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like the hair of drowned ghosts, and the water beneath was black as tar, hiding gators, catamoths, and sinkholes that could pull a man under in seconds. The air was thick, humid, suffocating, and in the wet season the ground itself disappeared, leaving only knee-deep muck that sucked at boots and swallowed footprints. White men feared it. They called it cursed, haunted, the devil's garden. But to the Seminole and the black Seminoles who lived there, it was home. It was freedom. The swamp did not judge by the color of your skin or the scars on your back. It judged by whether you knew how to survive it. And those who did not, those who came with chains and guns and arrogance, the swamp swallowed them whole. For decades, the Seminole had resisted removal, suggests. While other tribes were marched west on the Trail of Tears, the Seminoles stayed. They fought. They hid. They built villages deep in the wetlands where no cavalry could reach, where no map could guide an army. And they opened their arms to the runaway slaves who arrived bloodied, starving, desperate. These were not captives. They were allies, brothers, warriors. The black Seminoles married into the tribe, fought beside them, and together they created a society that the United States could not tolerate, a society where freedom was not a privilege granted by white men, but a right taken by force and defended with blood. By 1835, the tension had reached a breaking point. It suggests the Indian Removal Act had been signed. Andrew Jackson, the architect of genocide, demanded that every Seminole be driven west or exterminated. Plantation owners in Georgia and Alabama screamed for the return of their property. Men, women, children who had tasted freedom and would die before going back. So the overseers came, armed, paid, confident. 15 of them entered the Wahoo Swamp on the morning of December 28th, hunting fugitives. They believed they were predators, suggests. They were wrong, they were prey. Their names have been lost to history, but their type has not. Thomas Wickham, the leader, a Georgia overseer with a reputation for brutality. Just a man who wore a necklace of teeth he claimed came from runaways who resisted. Jacob Finch, a tracker from South Carolina known for using bloodhounds bred specifically to tear into human flesh. Samuel Court, jests, a mercenary who had no allegiance except to gold, who would hunt anything that paid. These were not soldiers. They were not lawmen. They were demons in human skin, men who had grown rich and drunk on the suffering of others, who measured their worth in the number of black bodies they dragged back to plantations in chains. They rode into the swamp at dawn with 15 men total, armed with muskets, pistols, whips, and the unshakable belief that God had placed them above all others. They laughed as they rode. They joked about the bonus they would collect for each. They returned or dead, it did not matter. Wickham had done this 100 times before. He knew the signs: broken branches, disturbed mud, The faint scent of cook fire carried on the wind. He had burned Seminole camps, separated mothers from children, shot men in the back as they fled. Jests. To him, this was not cruelty. It was business. It was order. It was the natural way of things. He believed the swamp would bend to him as everything else had. He believed the Seminole would scatter at the sound of gunfire, as they sometimes did. He believed that by nightfall he would return to Fort King with captives in tow and pockets full of coin. He did not know that for 3 days he and his men had been watched, tracked, studied. The Seminole warriors had noted every step they took, every campsite they made, every moment of carelessness. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were too arrogant to see it. Wickham would die believing he was in control. He would die wrong, and his scalp would hang from a warrior's belt before the sun reached its peak. They had no single name that white men could pronounce, but among the Seminole they were known as the Istichito, the Great Knives, 7 warriors, each one a legend in his own right, each one carrying scars that told stories of survival, resistance, and rage that had been tempered into steel. Leading them was a man named Osceola's brother in arms, to jest a black Seminole warrior called Abraham, though that was the name given to him by slavers, not the name his mother whispered when he was born free in the swamp. He was tall, lean, his skin dark as midnight, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He had escaped a Georgia plantation at 14, killed the overseer who tried to stop him with his bare hands, and walked 200 miles through hostile territory to reach Seminole land. He was 28 now. He had never worn chains again, jests, and he never would. Beside him was Thloclo Tusnuggy, a Seminole chief's son, a man who had watched his village burned by Andrew Jackson's soldiers when he was a boy, jests, who had sworn an oath over his mother's grave that he would repay that fire tenfold. There was also John Horse, another black Seminole, a translator, a tactician, jests, a man who understood both worlds and had chosen the one that did not treat him like cattle. And there were others, warriors whose faces were painted red and black, whose rifles were loaded, whose tomahawks were sharp, whose hearts beat with the singular purpose that had brought them into the swamp at dawn. Vengeance. Not random, not wild, calculated. Righteous. They had tracked the 15 overseers for 3 days. They knew Wickham's patterns. They knew Finch's bloodhounds. They knew Cord's habit of riding at the rear, cowardly, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. The warriors had chosen their ground carefully. A narrow passage through the swamp where the water deepened, suggests where cypress roots rose like bones from the earth, where there was no escape. They had set the trap. Now they waited, silent, patient, visible, deadly. The sun rose slowly, reluctantly, jests, as if it knew what was about to happen and did not want to bear witness. The overseers entered the killing ground at 7:30, their horses sloshing through water that had turned rust, colored from rotting leaves and algae. They were tired. 3 days in the swamp had worn them down. Mosquitoes had feasted on their skin, the heat had baked them inside their clothes, and the oppressive silence of the wetlands had begun to fray their nerves. Wickham barked orders to stay alert, but his men were sloppy now, distracted, eager to finish the hunt and return to civilization. Finch's dogs had lost the scent hours ago and were panting uselessly at his side. Cord muttered curses under his breath, swatting at flies, already imagining the whiskey he would drink when this was over. None of them saw the shadows moving in the trees. None of them noticed the ripples in the water that were not made by wind. None of them heard the bowstrings being drawn back, suggests slow and silent in the branches above. Abraham raised his hand, a signal. Not yet. Let them come deeper. Let them commit. The warriors did not move. They barely breathed. They had learned patience in a world that demanded it. Had learned stillness in a land that punished carelessness. The overseers rode further into the trap, their horses nervous now, ears flicking, sensing something their riders could not. Wickham pulled his rifle from his saddle. Scanning the tree line, his instincts finally whispering warnings his arrogance had ignored for days. But it was too late. He was surrounded, they all were. The swamp had closed around them like a fist, and there was no way out, suggests. Abraham's hand dropped. The first arrow flew. It struck Finch in the throat, punching through flesh and windpipe, dropping him from his horse without a sound. The dogs howled, the men shouted, and then the swamp exploded into violence, brutal, precise, and without mercy. The hunt was over. The slaughter had begun. Gunfire cracked through the humid air, but the overseers were firing blind, spinning in confusion, their bullets tearing into cypress bark and empty water. The Seminole warriors moved like ghosts, one moment invisible, the next emerging from the fog with tomahawks raised, war cries splitting the dawn. Abraham crashed into Wickham's horse, dragging the overseer from his saddle and into the mud. They grappled, Wickham clawing for his pistol, but Abraham was faster, stronger, fueled by 14 years of remembering the whip, the chain, the auction block. He drove his knife into Wickham's gut, twisted, suggests, and watched the man's eyes go wide with the realization that he was not the predator here. He had never been. Abraham yanked the blade upward through ribs and lung, and Wickham's scream died in a wet gurgle. His blood mixed with the swamp water, suggests, turning it darker still. Tlaloc swung his war club into Samuel Cord's skull with such force that bone shattered like pottery. Cord dropped instantly, his mercenary arrogance extinguished in a single heartbeat. John Horse fired his rifle point blank into another overseer's chest, the man's body jerking backward off his horse, dead before he hit the water. The bloodhounds, trained to hunt humans, now turned and fled, so yelping in terror as arrows found their flanks. The horses bucked and screamed, throwing their riders into the muck where warriors descended upon them with axes and knives. There was no honor here, no rules of engagement. This was extermination. Just this was the violence that had been inflicted upon their people returned tenfold, delivered with the cold efficiency of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. One overseer tried to run, splashing desperately through thigh-deep water, crying for mercy in a voice that had never shown mercy to anyone. He made it 10 feet before an arrow pierced his spine. He fell forward, face submerged, drowning in inches of water while his legs twitched uselessly. No one pulled him out, no one cared. The swamp drank him down. Within 20 minutes it was over. 15 men lay dead or dying in the blood-soaked mud of the Wahoo swamp. Jests. Their weapons scattered, their arrogance shattered, their bodies broken. The silence that followed the violence was profound. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, only the labored breathing of the warriors and the wet, gurgling sounds of men choking on their own blood. Abraham stood over Wickham's corpse, chest heaving, his knife still dripping. He looked down at the man who had terrorized so many, who had worn human teeth as trophies, and felt nothing. Just not satisfaction, not relief, only the cold, empty space where rage had burned moments before. He knelt down, pulled Wickham's head back by the hair, and with practiced precision made the cut. The scalp came away with a wet, tearing sound, skin and hair peeling from skull. Abraham held it up, letting the blood drip between his fingers, and the other warriors did the same, moving from body to body, taking what had been taken from their people for generations. Suggests this was not savagery, this was symbolism. This was communication in the only language that white men seemed to understand. Violence met with violence, brutality answered with brutality. Each scalp was a receipt, a record, a testament. The Seminole had learned this practice from European colonizers, who had paid bounties for native scalps, who had encouraged such butchery as policy, who had made trophies of human suffering. Now it was being returned to them, gift wrapped in their own blood. Tlaloc tied his scalps to his belt, his face expressionless, his movements ritualistic. John Horse whispered a prayer, not for the dead overseers, but for the souls of those they had hunted. Those who had died in chains, those who would never know freedom. The scalps would be displayed in the Seminole village not as celebration but as warning. Let the plantation owners see. Let the slave catchers know. Let Andrew Jackson himself understand the Seminole would not be removed. The swamps would not be conquered. And any man who came hunting human beings would leave only his bones. The warriors gathered the overseer's weapons. 15 rifles, powder, shot knives. They left the bodies where they fell for the gators and the buzzards. The swamp would erase them, as it had erased so many others. By nightfall there would be no trace except the stories whispered in fear. The warriors moved through the swamp as the sun climbed higher, their feet silent on ground that had drunk deep of blood. They traveled in single file, weapons ready, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of retaliation they knew would come. Abraham led them, the 15 scalps bundled and tied to a pole carried by the youngest warrior among them, a boy of 16 named Taka, who had watched his sister dragged back to a plantation 2 years prior and had sworn he would never let it happen again. The weight of those scalps was not heavy. It was liberation made tangible, justice made visible. Behind them, the swamp began its work of concealment. Water-filling boot prints, moss reclaiming disturbed branches, insects and scavengers descending upon the bodies to strip them of identity, to reduce them to bone and memory. Nature was complicit in this reckoning, an ally that asked no questions and kept all secrets. They walked for hours, navigating paths known only to those who had been born into this wilderness, or had learned it through necessity. The Wahoo Swamp was a maze to outsiders, a death trap to the arrogant, but to the Seminole it was a cathedral. Every tree marked, every waterway memorized, every sound interpreted. The warriors spoke little. There was no need. They had done what needed to be done, and words would not change it, would not soften it, would not make it anything other than what it was, a line drawn in blood that said, no further. Abraham thought of the plantation he had escaped, just the overseer he had killed with his bare hands at 14, the 200 miles he had walked with nothing but stars to guide him. He thought of the children born free in Seminole territory, who knew no master, suggests who would grow strong and wild and unbroken. This was what he fought for, not revenge alone but the future. The possibility that someone somewhere could live without fear of the chain. Just by mid-afternoon they reached the village, a cluster of chickees built on high ground surrounded by water and watchful eyes. Women and elders emerged, faces somber knowing. The scalps were hung from a central post, not as trophies of pride, but as evidence, as testament. The message had been sent. Now they would wait to see if it had been heard, or if more blood would be required to make the point clear. The Seminole village was not grand by the standards of white men who measured worth in marble and gold, but it was something far more valuable. It was sovereign. The chickees stood on wooden stilts above the swamp water, jests, their palmetto-thatched roofs angled to shed rain, their walls open to let the breeze pass through. There were no locks, no fences, no boundaries except those the land itself provided. Children played in the shallows, their laughter a sound that had been stolen from so many others, their skin ranging from deep brown to copper, evidence of the union between black Seminoles and native Seminoles, a unity forged not in blood alone, but in shared resistance, shared suffering, shared refusal to be erased. This was a place where former slaves walked as equals, where a man was judged not by the color of his skin, but by his courage, his loyalty, his willingness to defend what was sacred. It was a place the United States government could not tolerate, because its very existence was a rejection of everything the empire stood for. Abraham entered his chickee and found his wife Yaha grinding corn, just, her hands moving in the rhythm of a life lived without chains. She looked up at him, saw the blood on his clothes, the exhaustion in his eyes, and said nothing. She simply stood, brought him water, and waited. He drank deeply, then spoke in the Seminole tongue he had learned over 14 years, the language of his adopted people, the language of his freedom. 15, he said. All dead.
The message is sent.
Yaha nodded slowly. She knew what this meant. Retaliation would come, soldiers would march, the fragile peace they had carved from the swamp would be tested again. But she also knew that to do nothing, just to let the slave catchers roam freely, to allow their children to grow up in fear, was a death of a different kind, a death of the spirit. Abraham had made the only choice a free man could make. He had fought back, across the village. The scalps hung from the post, turning slowly in the wind. Elders gathered around them, speaking in low voices, debating what would come next. The young warriors sharpened their weapons. The women prepared food and medicine. Knowing that war was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. The village that refused to bow was about to be tested as never before. News of the massacre traveled faster than any rider could carry it. Suggests a trapper stumbled upon the bodies 3 days later, half devoured by gators, scalped and mutilated, and he rode hard to Fort King with terror in his voice and madness in his eyes. Within a week, every plantation from Georgia to Alabama knew the story. 15 white men slaughtered in the swamp, their scalps taken, their bodies left to rot. The slaveholders erupted in fury and fear. They demanded military action. They demanded extermination. They demanded that the Seminole be hunted down, every village burned, every man, woman, and child driven west or killed. The newspapers printed editorials dripping with racist venom, suggests calling the Seminoles savages, calling the black Seminoles mongrels, calling for the total eradication of the Negro-Indian alliance that dared to offer sanctuary to escaped slaves. Andrew Jackson, now in his final year as president, just gave his blessing. Major General Thomas Jessup was dispatched with orders that were as clear as they were cruel: crush the Seminole, reclaim the escaped slaves, and make an example so brutal that no tribe would ever dare resist again. But something else was happening, something the slaveholders did not anticipate. The story of the 15 scalps spread through the slave quarters, whispered in the dead of night, a jest passed from plantation in coded songs and hidden messages. It became a legend, a spark of hope in the suffocating darkness of bondage. Slaves who had never seen the swamp, who had never met a Seminole warrior, began to dream of it, a place where men fought back, where freedom was not a distant promise but a present reality. Some began to plan their escapes. Others sabotaged their masters' fields, slowed their work, resisted in small, invisible ways. The 15 scalps had become a symbol, proof that the slaveholders were not invincible, that their guns and laws and violence could be met with equal force. The overseers grew paranoid, beating their captives harder, watching the tree lines with nervous eyes, knowing that the swamp was out there waiting, and that every night more souls might slip away toward it. The whisper that began in the Wahoo swamp was becoming a roar, suggests, and the slaveholders could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. They had wanted to send a message by hunting escaped slaves. Instead, they had created martyrs. They had created legend. They had created the very thing they feared most, hope. In February of 1836, 2 months after the scalping of the 15 overseers, the United States Army marched into Florida with the largest military force ever assembled against a native tribe. Over 5,000 soldiers, regulars, militia, suggests volunteers, along with artillery, supply wagons, and tracker units specially trained in swamp warfare. They came with orders signed by the Secretary of War himself: total subjugation. Find the Seminole villages, burn them. Kill the warriors. Capture the black Seminoles and return them to bondage. Show no mercy. Leave no survivors who might inspire future resistance. Major General Thomas Jesup commanded this force with the cold efficiency of a man who saw the Seminole not as people, but as obstacles to progress, as inconveniences to be removed so that Florida could be made safe for white settlement and cotton cultivation. He had fought in the War of 1812, had crushed uprisings before, and he believed, truly believed, that superior numbers and firepower would end this conflict in weeks. He was wrong. The Seminole did not meet him in open battle. They did not line up in neat rows to be mowed down by cannon fire. Instead, they disappeared. The villages the army found were empty, recently abandoned, cook fires still warm but no people in sight. The soldiers marched deeper into the swamps, and the land itself turned hostile. Men sank into mud up to their waists. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that soldiers choked on them. Gators pulled sentries into the water at night. Snipers fired from the trees and vanished before anyone could return fire. Entire patrols went missing. Found days later with their throats cut, their weapons gone, their bodies left as warnings, the soldiers began to call it Seminole warfare. A type of combat they had never trained for, where the enemy was invisible, suggests where every shadow could hide death, where the very earth seemed to conspire against them. Morale collapsed, desertion rates soared. Jesup's grand campaign, designed to crush resistance in weeks, dragged into months, then years. The swamp was devouring his army, and the Seminole, outnumbered, outgunned but never outmatched in determination, continued to fight, and at the heart of that resistance, in a village deep in the Wahoo swamps, Abraham and his warriors prepared for the next wave, knowing that the 15 scalps hanging from the post had bought them something precious: time, and the certainty that they would never surrender. The Second Seminole War would rage for 7 years, the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. It would cost the United States over $40 million, the lives of more than 1,500 soldiers, and the reputation of every general who tried and failed to defeat a force that never numbered more than a few thousand warriors. The Seminole employed tactics that would later be studied in military academy as guerrilla warfare, scorched earth retreats, psychological terror, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that turned geography itself into a weapon. They struck at dawn and disappeared by noon. They ambushed supply lines, burned forts, and killed officers in their sleep. They moved their families constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered, never committing to a battle they could not win, And the black Seminoles fought with a ferocity that terrified even hardened soldiers, because they knew what capture meant: not death, but a return to slavery, a fate worse than any bullet. They fought as men with nothing to lose and everything to protect. Abraham became a legend within that war. He led raids that destroyed entire companies. He negotiated temporary truces and then vanished before they could be enforced. He became a ghost that haunted the nightmares of plantation owners, a name whispered with fear and grudging respect even by those who wanted him dead. The army tried to buy him, offering freedom and land if he would betray his people. He refused. They tried to kill him in ambush after ambush, and each time he survived, his legend grew. He was not a man anymore. He was an idea, a living embodiment of resistance, proof that the machinery of slavery and subjugation could be resisted, could be fought, could be bled. By 1842, the United States government, exhausted and humiliated, declared victory and withdrew most of its forces. They had not won. They had simply given up. The Seminole were offered a compromise. Those who wanted to could stay in Florida, deep in the swamps, in land too miserable for white men to want. It was not the victory the Seminole had hoped for, but it was survival. It was refusal made flesh. And somewhere in the Wahoo swamp chests, 15 scalps still hung, rotting slowly, a reminder of the day when hunted men became hunters, when the oppressed became the reckoning, when blood answered blood and the swamp drank deep. Pause here. Let the weight of this settle. 15 men entered a swamp believing themselves gods, and they left as ghosts, their scalps hanging as testament to a truth the powerful never want you to know: empires are not invincible. The enslaved are not helpless. And history is not written only by victors. It is written by those who refuse to be erased. If this story has gripped you, if you feel the fire of it in your chest, then do not let it end here. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with the names of resistances forgotten, with the stories your teachers never told. Because every time you engage, every time you spread this truth, you become part of the reckoning. Jests. You become a voice that refuses to let these warriors be forgotten. The Seminole and the Black Seminoles who fought are owed more than silence. They are owed remembrance. They are owed this. Suggests that we carry their defiance forward into a world that still needs it. Now, let us finish what we started. Abraham lived to see the end of the war, but he did not live to see peace. By 1843, he was in his mid-30s, scarred, weary, his body carrying the accumulated damage of 100 battles. He had lost friends, brothers in arms, warriors who had stood beside him in the Wahoo swamp and never made it home. He had watched villages burn, children die, suggests families torn apart by a war that should never have been fought. The victory, such as it was, tasted like ash. Yes, some Seminole remained in Florida. Yes, the government had retreated. But thousands had been forcibly removed to Oklahoma, marched westward in chains, and hundreds of Black Seminoles had been captured and returned to slavery despite promises of freedom. The compromise was bitter. The survival was costly. And Abraham knew that the fight was not truly over. It had simply paused, waiting for the next generation to take up the burden. He settled in a hidden village deep in the Everglades, a place so remote that even the most determined slave catchers would not find it. He married again. Yaha had died of fever during the war, and had children who would grow up free, who would never know the plantation, who would learn to move through the swamp as he had, silent and deadly. He taught them the story of the 15 scalps, not as a tale of glory, but as a lesson that freedom is never given, it is taken. Jests. And it must be defended with everything you have. He taught them that the world is not just, that empires do not care for mercy, and that the only protection against tyranny is the willingness to meet it with equal force. His children listened, and they remembered. Abraham died in 1870, an old man by the standards of those who lived hard lives, his body finally giving out after decades of war and survival. He was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Everglades, the location known only to his family, hidden so that no one could desecrate it, no one could turn him into a trophy. His name faded from official records. The history books written by the victors barely mentioned him. But in the Seminole communities, in the whispered stories passed down through generations, he lived on. He became myth. He became the man who scalped 15 overseers and started a war that an empire could not win. Suggests the scalps themselves disappeared, as all physical things eventually do. Some say they were buried in a sacred ceremony after the war ended, returned to the earth as an offering. Others claim they were burned. Their ashes scattered across the swamp so that the spirits of those violent men could never find rest. A few whispered that they were kept, hidden away in a place known only to the elders, a relic of a war that must never be forgotten. Jests. But the truth is, it does not matter what happened to the scalps. What mattered was what they represented. A moment when the hunted became hunters, when terror was repaid with terror. Suggests when 15 men who believed themselves untouchable learned in their final moments that no one is beyond the reach of justice, no matter how delayed, no matter how brutal. The Seminole Wars officially ended. But the spirit that drove Abraham and his warriors never did. It lived on in every act of resistance, every escape, every refusal to bow. It lived in the maroon communities of Jamaica, in the Quilombos of Brazil, in the rebellions that sparked across the slaveholding South. It lived in Nat Turner's revolt, in John Brown's raid, in Harriet Tubman's 19 trips back into slave territory to lead others to freedom. The thread of defiance that ran through the Wahoo swamp ran through all of them. A refusal to accept that some people are born to suffer so that others may prosper. a rejection of the lie that power and cruelty are the same as righteousness. The 15 scalps were a declaration written in blood: we will not go quietly, we will not die on our knees, and if you come for us you will pay a price that no amount of gold can cover. Historians have tried to sanitize this story, to frame it as savagery, to paint the Seminole and Black Seminoles as mindless killers rather than desperate people defending their lives and freedom. But the descendants of those warriors know better. They carry the truth in their bones, jests, in the stories their grandparents told, in the knowledge that survival sometimes requires violence. That peace is a luxury afforded only to those who have never had to fight for their humanity, jests. The echo of that December morning in 1835 still reverberates through the swamps of Florida, through the history of resistance, through every soul that refuses to be broken. What do we learn from the 15 scalps, jests? What truth can be pulled from the blood-soaked mud of the Wahoo Swamp? First, that oppression always carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The slaveholders believed they could hunt human beings without consequence, that they could send overseers into the swamp with impunity, that their power was absolute. They were wrong. Every act of cruelty creates resistance. Every chain forged creates the desire to break it. Every whip raised creates the hand that will one day strike back. The 15 overseers were not killed because the Seminole were savage. They were killed because savagery had been inflicted upon the Seminole and the Black Seminoles for generations, and on that December morning the bill came due. Second, we learned that solidarity is stronger than any army. The alliance between the Seminole and the Black Seminoles was not born of convenience. It was born of shared suffering, shared enemies, shared dreams of freedom, jests. In a world designed to divide them, they chose unity. They married, fought, died, and survived together. That unity made them unbeatable even when facing forces that outnumbered them 10-1. The United States government understood this, jests, which is why they worked so hard to break that alliance, offering bribes, making false promises, sowing distrust. They knew that a unified resistance was the greatest threat to their power, and they were right to fear it. Third, we learn that history belongs to those who refuse to let it be buried. The story of Abraham, of Thloclo Tusnugee, of John Horse, of the warriors who took 15 scalps in the Wahoo Swamp. This story was not taught in schools, jests. It was not commemorated with statues or holidays. It was erased deliberately because it is a dangerous story. It is a story that reminds the oppressed that they have power. It is a story that tells those in chains that their chains can be broken. It is a story that says loudly and without apology that resistance is not only justified, it is necessary. The historians who tried to bury this story failed, because the descendants remembered. Because oral tradition is stronger than any official record. Because some truths are too powerful to be erased, no matter how hard empires try. The 15 scalps are gone, but the lesson remains, carved into the earth, written in blood. Jest's freedom is never free. It is paid for, always. If you go to the Wahoo Swamp today, if you walk carefully through the moss-draped cypress, if you listen to the way the water moves and the wind whispers through the sawgrass, you can still feel them. Jests, the warriors, the hunters who became the hunted, the men who refused to die quietly. Locals will tell you the swamp is haunted, that at dawn you can sometimes hear the echo of gunfire, the scream of horses, the war cries of men who have been dead for nearly 2 centuries. They will tell you that there are places in the swamp where nothing grows, where the water runs cold even in summer, where the air feels heavy with the weight of old violence. Skeptics dismiss these stories as superstition, as folklore meant to keep trespassers away, but the descendants of the Seminole know better. They know that some acts of resistance leave scars on the land itself, that some battles are so profound they become part of the earth's memory, that the swamp remembers what history books try to forget. There is no monument to Abraham, no plaque marking the spot where 15 overseers died. Like a museum exhibit explaining the Seminole resistance or the alliance with escaped slaves that made it possible. The official history of Florida barely mentions them, preferring instead to celebrate pioneers and entrepreneurs, to frame the Seminole Wars as unfortunate but necessary steps toward progress. But the absence of a monument does not mean the absence of memory. The Seminole tribe of Florida still exists, still sovereign, still undefeated in the true sense. They never signed a peace treaty. They never surrendered. They simply outlasted an empire that tried to erase them. And among them, the story of the 15 scalps is still told. Not with pride, not with celebration, suggests, but with the solemn understanding that survival sometimes requires becoming the thing you fear most. That freedom sometimes demands blood. The ghosts who walk the Wahoo Swamp are not asking for forgiveness. They are not seeking redemption, suggests. They are simply there, eternal witnesses to a truth that power wishes to conceal, that the oppressed do not always lose, that empires are not invincible, that 15 men can enter a swamp believing themselves gods and leave as nothing but meat for the gators. The swamp remembers, and so must we. December 20th, 1835, a date that lives in no textbook, celebrated by no holiday, and marked by no official remembrance. But it lives nonetheless, in the bloodline of those who survived, in the whispered stories of resistance, in the swamps of Florida where the land itself holds memory. 15 overseers rode into the Wahoo Swamp that morning, confident in their cruelty, secure in their power, certain that the world belonged to men like them. By noon they were dead, scalped, erased, returned to the earth as a message that echoed across a continent: we will not be hunted without hunting back. We will not be broken without breaking you in return. The warriors who killed them, Abraham, Thloclo, Tusnuggy, John Horse, suggests, and the others whose names were stolen by history, did not do it for glory. They did it because there was no other choice. Because slavery is not a condition to be endured, it is a crime to be resisted. Because freedom, real freedom, is taken with bloody hands or not at all. This story does not end with triumph. It ends with survival, with cost, with the bitter knowledge that justice in this world is rarely clean and never cheap. The Seminole paid in blood and tears and generations lost, but they survived, they remain, and the 15 scalps that hung from that post in 1835 became more than trophies. They became a reckoning, a prophecy fulfilled, a promise kept. The empire that tried to erase them failed. The slaveholders who believed themselves invincible learned otherwise. And somewhere in the Everglades, in the dark water and ancient trees, the spirits of those warriors still stand guard, reminding us that resistance is not a footnote in history. It is the spine upon which history stands. Remember their names even when the names have been forgotten. Remember their defiance even when the world tries to erase it. Suggests because the swamp remembers, and legends once born in blood never truly die. They wait, they watch, they whisper, we were here, we fought, we won.